Imagine this. You've spent your entire life working hard, making the right choices, a steady job, a mortgage, a car loan, insurance for the future. You've done everything you were told to do. But one morning, you wake up to find that everything you thought was secure has turned to dust. Your house, your car, your savings, your investments, all of it, gone. This isn't a nightmare, it's a reality that's played out in countless countries, and it could happen to anyone, anywhere. Meet Isabella, a 43-year-old accountant living in a quiet neighborhood. She's married, has a few kids, and a solid career. She has a home she's paying off, a car she drives every day, and a small vacation property she bought years ago, all with the belief that these were the pillars of her security. But today, as she watches the news, everything starts to unravel. The government just froze all bank accounts. The currency has lost nearly 70% of its value. Her world, like the world of millions of others, is about to collapse. And Isabella will soon discover that the very things she trusted to keep her safe are the first to fail. Stay tuned, because what happens next will shock you. Isabella's life has always felt like a careful balance, a system built on stability. She had a secure job at an accounting firm, a modest but comfortable home she purchased with a 30-year mortgage. Every month, the payment seemed like just a small sacrifice for a lifetime of security. Her car, a mid-range sedan bought on credit, was reliable and suited her family's needs. And her vacation home, nestled in the countryside outside Mendoza, was her dream retreat, a place to escape, a piece of real estate she thought would only increase in value. Isabella had checked all the boxes. Her education at the University of Buenos Aires had secured her a stable career. She had insurance, investments, and savings in her pension fund. These were all the things society told her she needed to be secure. Her life was built on the idea that if she worked hard, saved smartly, and made the right decisions, she'd be protected from the world's uncertainties. For years, these choices felt like success. After all, the middle class was taught that these investments were the very definition of progress. The house you own, the car in your driveway, the insurance to safeguard your future. She would retire one day, comfortably, knowing her home and assets were protected. Every morning, she drove her children to school, ran errands in her reliable car, and sat down to a steady job. She had what everyone told her she needed, a solid, dependable life. But this morning, something changed. As Isabella sat with her morning coffee, watching the news, the world as she knew it started to collapse. The government had just announced a national emergency. Bank accounts were frozen. No one could withdraw more than 250 pesos a week. Her savings, the ones she had been so careful to accumulate, were now out of reach. And that was just the beginning. At first, Isabella couldn't comprehend the scale of what was happening. She thought it was just a temporary measure, a minor glitch, something that would be fixed soon. But as the day went on, the reality began to sink in. Her bank accounts, frozen. The pesos she had saved, now worth only a fraction of what they were yesterday. The dollar, which had once been pegged to her national currency, was abandoned. The value of everything she had was plummeting. The government said it would be temporary, but soon it was clear. This wasn't a short-term issue. It was the beginning of a full-blown economic collapse. The currency that had been stable for decades was now losing value by the hour. By the time the week ended, the peso was worth only a fraction of what it had been just days before. As riots spread across the country, the streets of Buenos Aires became tense and chaotic, and Isabella watched helplessly from her apartment. She couldn't understand why, with all the right decisions she'd made, her life had come to this. Her once stable home, the one that was supposed to secure her future, suddenly seemed like a heavy weight rather than a source of pride. Real estate, she had been told, was a sure bet. Everyone said property always appreciated. It was supposed to be a safety net. But now, no one could afford to buy. No one wanted to purchase anything. The real estate market froze. There were no buyers for anything, not even for the house that she had worked so hard to afford. And it wasn't just her home that was losing its value. The car she had financed, the one she thought would help her keep her family mobile, was now another burden. Gas prices skyrocketed, and fuel became scarce. She couldn't afford to drive it anymore. Even the car that had seemed like an asset just weeks ago now felt like an anchor, a reminder of how fragile her life had truly been. But Isabella still had her vacation property outside Mendoza, right? That small retreat she bought in the hopes of escaping her hectic life and creating lasting memories with her family. It was supposed to be a secure investment, a piece of land that would only appreciate over time. But now, in the midst of the chaos, she couldn't sell it. Nobody was buying. No one had the money, and even if they did, who would want to spend it on a vacation home in the middle of an economic collapse? Isabella's life, once so carefully structured and predictable, had been turned upside down. The pieces that seemed so secure, her real estate, her car, her savings, now sat like dead weight. She was starting to understand something that no one had ever warned her about. Those things she believed to be investments, those things she was told were safe, were now liabilities. And she wasn't alone. As the news spread, Isabella learned that this wasn't just her problem. It was the problem of millions of people all over the world, from Argentina to Greece to Zimbabwe to Venezuela. People like her were realizing that what they thought were safe investments were the very things that would fail them in times of economic collapse. Isabella continued to watch her world unravel. She began to understand a painful truth. The very systems she had trusted to protect her, the systems that promised stability and growth, had failed. The idea of home ownership, of securing a car, of saving for retirement, all of it seemed like common wisdom, the building blocks of a safe and secure life. But in times of economic collapse, these assets lose their value, and it's not because they're inherently bad investments. It's because the financial architecture around them, the structure that made them work, has crumbled. Let's break it down. Real estate, once seen as the ultimate symbol of financial security, is often the first casualty of an economic collapse. For years, Isabella had heard that real estate prices always go up. It was drilled into her. Buy a home, it's an investment. But when the economy crashes, the dynamics change. Property values fall, and even if the building remains standing, the market for it disappears. It's not just about the house, it's about the entire system that supports its value. The banks stop lending, mortgages become unaffordable, property taxes rise as governments scramble to cover their budget deficits. In Greece, after the sovereign debt crisis began in 2010, property values in Athens plummeted by nearly 42% over 5 years. But that wasn't the worst part. The real problem was liquidity. The market froze. No one could buy or sell property because the economy had collapsed and banks stopped financing home loans. Even worse, the Greek government began raising property taxes dramatically, making it harder for homeowners to keep their properties. In the end, many Greeks were trapped in homes they couldn't sell, couldn't rent out, and couldn't afford to maintain. Isabella's vacation property outside of Mendoza, which she had believed would appreciate, was now worth half of what she paid for it. It wasn't just the drop in value, it was the inability to sell it. No one was buying second homes during an economic emergency. The maintenance costs, property taxes, and utility bills still had to be paid, even though she could no longer access the money she had once saved. She was stuck. Her once prized asset had become a drain on her resources. Next, Isabella turned her attention to her car, the symbol of her family's mobility and independence. Like so many middle-class families, she had bought the car on credit, believing it was an investment in her family's future. But as the price of fuel soared and infrastructure crumbled, her car became a reminder of how fragile her investments were. In Venezuela, where the economy had spiraled into hyperinflation, the automobile became a useless object for most people. People bought cars at record rates in the years leading up to the collapse, believing that purchasing a car in an inflationary environment was a way to preserve value. But by 2016, as inflation surged to 800% annually and the economy contracted by 30%, the car, once considered an asset, became a liability. Fuel, despite Venezuela's vast oil reserves, became scarce. Spare parts, which were once easy imported, disappeared as the economy collapsed. Tires became so expensive that a set of 4 new tires cost more than most people's annual salary. And even when people had cars, they couldn't use them. Roads deteriorated and fuel became too scarce and expensive to afford. The infrastructure that once supported the automobile industry had disintegrated. What was once an investment in security had become an expensive decoration. Isabella now saw that the car she financed was no longer a tool for independence. It was an anchor, weighing her down in a world where nothing worked the way it used to. But it wasn't just her home and her car. Isabella had paid into a life insurance policy for years, believing that it would provide a safety net in case something went wrong. She had faithfully made her payments, knowing that one day it would pay off. But when the economy collapses, so too do the promises made by financial institutions. In Germany during the early 2020s, as hyperinflation ravaged the country, the value of life insurance policies collapsed. A policy that might have been worth enough to buy a house in 1914 was worth less than a loaf of bread by 1923. This wasn't just a financial loss, it was the loss of trust in a system that had promised to provide for people in their later years. The same thing happened in Argentina in the early 2000s. The government seized private pension funds, leaving workers without the security they had spent years saving for. In the end, many Greeks were trapped in homes they couldn't sell, couldn't rent out, and couldn't afford to maintain. As Isabella sat in her living room surrounded by the remnants of the life she thought was secure, the weight of the truth began to sink in. The world she had built, the home, the car, the savings, all of it had been based on an illusion. The financial system she had trusted had crumbled. The assumptions she had made about her future, the ones she had followed so diligently, were now exposed as fragile and unreliable. Her home, once an emblem of success, was now a liability. She couldn't sell it. She couldn't even afford to keep it. The value had dropped, and with it, her hope of using it to secure her financial future. The mortgage remained, though the payments now felt impossible. In some ways, it was worse than losing the house outright. She was still tied to it, unable to escape. The taxes, the maintenance, the utilities, they kept coming. The system had failed her, and she was left holding the bill. Her car, which had once represented mobility and independence, sat idle in the driveway. Isabella had bought it on credit, like so many others, believing it would provide stability. Now, fuel was too expensive to buy, the roads were deteriorating, spare parts were impossible to find. The car, which she had been paying for month after month, had become an expensive piece of metal that served no practical purpose. What she thought was a smart purchase, a vehicle that would help her family navigate life, was now a burden. The loan still remained, though, and that was something she couldn't shake. And her life insurance policy? It had become nothing more than a piece of paper. The promise of financial security in times of trouble had vanished along with the value of the currency. The payout, when it finally came, didn't even cover the basics, groceries, utilities, or the rent on her apartment. The future she had planned for, the retirement, the vacations, the peace of mind, had slipped through her fingers. This wasn't just happening to Isabella. It wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was the story of millions of people, not just in Argentina, but in countries around the world. In Greece, Spain, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, people were waking up to the reality that the very assets they trusted to protect them in times of trouble had become their chains, tying them to a system that no longer existed. In Venezuela, families who had bought cars at inflated prices in the early 2010s found themselves unable to use them. Gas stations ran dry, spare parts disappeared, their once prized possessions were now useless. The same pattern had played out in Argentina during the 2001 economic collapse, where once valuable properties became nothing more than a drain on resources. People couldn't sell, couldn't escape, couldn't even afford to maintain what they had worked so hard to acquire. For those who had bought property, who had taken on mortgages, who had invested in long-term financial products, the collapse of the financial system revealed how vulnerable they were. It wasn't about whether these assets were inherently good investments, it was about the stability of the system they were built on, and when that system broke, these assets became dead weight. Isabella sat in her apartment looking at the documents scattered on her table, her mortgage agreements, her car loan papers, her life insurance policy. They no longer felt like symbols of security, they felt like chains, each one binding her to a world that no longer existed. The system, the one she had believed in, had betrayed her. She had trusted it to provide her with a future, to give her family stability, but in the end, all it had provided her with was uncertainty. The wealth she had accumulated over years of hard work had evaporated. The promises made by banks, governments, and financial institutions were shattered. And she was left with nothing but the harsh reality that in an economic collapse, the middle class, the ones who believed they were safe because they followed the rules, are the ones who are hit hardest. Isabella's story is the story of so many others. The collapse of the system isn't just an abstract concept, it's a personal tragedy for the millions of people who thought they were doing everything right. But in the face of economic collapse, everything they believed in crumbled, leaving them with nothing but the wreckage of their once secure lives. As Isabella sat in the quiet of her apartment with the weight of her situation pressing heavily on her, a profound realization began to form. The life she had built was not just a series of financial decisions, it was a bet that the system she had trusted would hold, that the economy would remain stable, that the promises of growth and security would be fulfilled. But when the system broke, everything she had placed her trust in, everything she had worked so hard for, vanished. The truth was harsh. No asset, no matter how secure it appeared, was immune to the collapse of the financial system. Real estate, automobiles, life insurance, retirement savings, all of these, once considered the foundation of a stable life, had become liabilities in the face of an economic crisis. Isabella's home, her car, her insurance, these were not guarantees, they were risks. And in the moment of collapse, those risks were exposed. Isabella's story was not an isolated one. Across the world, countless people had trusted the system in the same way. In Greece, young professionals returned from university only to find that their degrees held no value in an economy that had collapsed. In Zimbabwe, people rushed to buy consumer goods during hyperinflation, only to find that those goods had no residual value when the economy imploded. In Argentina, property owners like Isabella were left with homes they couldn't sell, couldn't maintain, and couldn't escape. But even though the collapse of the system left them trapped, it wasn't the end of the story, it was a lesson. Isabella had learned that true financial security doesn't come from trusting in the system. It comes from understanding the system's fragility. The middle class, those who believed in the promises of stability and growth, were the ones who suffered the most. But those who understood the risks, those who maintained liquidity, flexibility, and optionality, were the ones who fared better when the collapse came. The lesson here isn't just about financial collapse. It's about the nature of risk itself. In a stable economy, these purchases may seem like the smart choice, but when the system fails, those same purchases can become traps, leaving you with nothing but the weight of debt and depreciating assets. The middle class, once the cornerstone of the economy, becomes the most vulnerable when everything falls apart. Isabella's future may still be uncertain, but one thing is clear. She's learned the most important lesson of all. The only true security in an uncertain world is adaptability. It's about understanding that stability is never guaranteed. It's about recognizing the fragility of the system and structuring your life in a way that allows you to survive and even thrive when that system inevitably breaks. Isabella may not have the life she envisioned, but in the rubble of what she lost, she has gained something more valuable, a deeper understanding of the system, and a new approach to building security in an unstable world. The question remains for all of us. Are we prepared for the next collapse? Are we holding on to things that could become liabilities in a world where nothing is guaranteed? The collapse isn't a matter of if, but when, and the only way to weather the storm is to understand the risks we are taking and to plan for a future where adaptability is our greatest asset.